I'm excited today to be joined by Rob Walch. Rob was inducted, I should say, into the Podcasting Hall of Fame in 2016, and he's the Vice President of Podcaster Relations for Lipson. He's the co-author of Tricks of the Podcasting Masters, an editor's pick for a top 10 reference book in 2006 by Amazon. Rob started podcasting in 2004 as the host of the award-winning Podcast 411 podcast, where he interviewed guests such as Quincy Jones, Walt Mossberg, who I used to love, the Wall Street Journal, and Larry Kudlow. He's consulted on podcasting for Jack Welch, Tim Ferriss, eBay, just to name a few. Now, if you don't know Libsyn, they pioneered the system to host and publish podcasts in 2004, and since then have grown to become the largest leading podcast network worldwide. Rob, welcome to the Go for Launch podcast.
Brandon, thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Well, we are in COVID days, so we're both working from the home offices, as you can tell. Yeah. And I hope my kids won't come in and interrupt me, and you never know. So that's just the way it goes. But I'm excited to have Rob because I've been on Lipson for a long time, hosting the Go for Launch podcast. I have pod faded, which I just discovered that term today. So I'm going to talk to Rob about that concept here in a little bit. But I wanted to just really dive into what podcasting really kind of looks like in 2020, Rob, and you are one of the experts. So give us an idea about, how many people are actively listening to podcasts now, how many shows the average person listens to, and how many total podcasts are there out there at this point?
Well, as far as the number that people are listening to, the Edison report, based on what's being listened to in the U.S., and that number is about 110 million, roughly 104, 110 million, somewhere around there of people in the U.S. And globally, the number is estimated between 150 and 200 million. Wow. I'd say it's closer to 200 million people today are listening globally to podcasts, and that number continues to grow. And I think the most important reason why it's grown so much in the last few years is podcasting has become ubiquitous. Anywhere you listen to audio today, you can find podcasts in that service. It used to be just Apple Podcasts, right? And then there was Stitcher and Overcast and Pocket Cast, but those weren't the mainstream applications. Now it's Google Podcasts, it's Deezer, it's Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, radio.com. There's so many places now that you can find podcasts. It's really helped grow the space. Again, it's really easy as a podcaster to just say, hey, listen to me wherever you listen to audio. That's what I say on my show.
I love that. And I love the fact that Libsyn has all those channels, built in. So it's really easy, couple, clicks, and you're on Google Play, you're on Spotify, you're just distributing pretty much, like you said, everywhere podcasts are available. Now, I've read some ancillary, information that COVID has possibly impacted podcasting. Is that the case? Is podcast listenership down, or is it actually up? What's the deal with that?
So, there was a point where it was down. I mean, and it started to drop, and at the worst, at the end of April, and we saw about an 18 to 20% decline in podcast consumption, and that was comparing it to a baseline of the first few weeks of January, and now we're back up and a little above where we were in January. Interesting thing, what we've seen, and this is from data from Apple, and they looked at requests for directions, whether you're asking for mass transit directions in the car, or walking directions. And during that point, at that peak trough where it was dropped the most, Apple had seen the most drop in requests. And when that came back up, we started to see it. But the only thing that came back was the driving directions. Mass transit directions are off 50% from where they were in January.
Wow.
Driving directions are up 25%.
Okay.
People are actually driving more solo than they are before. So my joke, people are not taking mass transit. So the joke is, well, Queen was wrong and Gary Newman was right.
Nice. I love it. Well, I'm glad to hear that things have come back up. But I also selfishly think, even if things are down, listenership is down, I feel like it's a great time to jump into podcasting. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely. There's, you asked, and I didn't answer yet, was how many podcasts are out there? Well, it depends on what number you want to go by. Number of feeds that are active or shows that are active. If you look at the number of feeds that are still live, there's a 1.1 million in Apple Podcasts. When you look at how many of them actually released a new episode in the last 90 days and have at least 10 episodes, then that number comes down to 300,000.
Wow.
So
okay.
300,000 is the number of active podcasts. And if you take that active podcast and compare it to the 750 million blogs that are in the world, podcast to blog is like 2,700 to 1 ratio of blogs to podcasts.
Yeah, that's mind blowing. And I'm glad you clarified that statistic, because even me as a podcaster and you as a longtime podcaster, you kind of think, oh, it's 2020. This stuff started in 2004. It's way too late for me. I can't get started. I can't make a dent. But when you realize that, like you said, actively, there's only 300,000 episodes being released weekly, that's an amazing opportunity for the little guy to jump in and have a voice and have an active podcast.
Yeah, and the number really is low compared to blogging. So people, they say, "Oh, it's." I hear it. People go, "Oh, it's too late. It's saturated." I go, "Would you say the same thing about having a blog? Right? Would you have a blog for your business?" Yes. Well, that's saturated. Why would you not have a podcast for your business? Every business should have a podcast. Every book author should have a podcast.
No doubt. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can just completely repurpose podcasting content. I love it because you and I are going to talk for 30 minutes roughly. The amount of words that you and I will speak, because you're from the North, you speak fast. When I talk to people from the North, even though if I'm from the South, I try to speak faster. We're going to say a lot of words. Those words are indexed now, and they also can be transcribed and stuff like that. I want to get into that a little bit more, because there's some exciting developments happening with the words that we are speaking on a podcast being indexed. So that's really cool. But let me ask you more about Lipson specifically, some stats, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. How many podcasts roughly does Lipson host?
We host over 69,000 active podcasts.
Okay. And you guys are the godfather of podcasting. So you're the
we were the first, right? We started in November 2004. So before Apple ever supported podcasting, Libsyn was there and hosting podcasts. We've been doing it for 15 and a half years now.
That is fantastic. I think my first podcast wasn't until 2008, which was still early, right? But you had to do a lot of finagling back then to figure this stuff out. And you were early on the scene, obviously, and went with your book, which by the way needs a refresh because it's so content rich. I thought a funny thing when I was looking back at the book was that your foreword, you remember that was written by Senator John Edwards.
I always say it's a collector's item because nobody else is going to have a book with a foreword written by him again.
Yeah, Senator John Edwards, which kids look that up if you don't know who he is. He had a huge shot at presidency and blew it. But
he was the first major politician that podcast.
That was cool to see that you at that time you landed him. That's pretty marquee forward. So what about on Libsyn? About how many episodes are published on a daily basis on average?
It's it's a little over now, or right around 4,000 a day.
Okay.
So we see right around 4,000 new episodes a day come out.
Okay. So again, if you're ever thinking about doing a podcast and you do the math, how many people are posting on Instagram every 10 seconds? Hundreds of thousands of people. Blogs, like you said, a lot of blogs. And by the way, people don't read as much anymore. They're going to be more likely to listen when they're at the gym, they're making dinner, they're in the car, they're on the train, whatever. And so podcasting is a killer medium. And all of us are preaching to the choir here. But just to let you know, if I'm thinking 4,000 people, I have a shot of people listening to my podcast. Speaking of, if somebody thinks about, all right, I want to do a show, what's the average length or what's the best length you think? I know there's pros and cons to doing 30 minutes versus the Tim Ferriss hour and a half or whatever.
Well, there is no ideal length. It really comes down to how much content you have. If you've got 15 minutes of content, do 15 minutes. You have an hour, do an hour. But when we look at the most popular podcasts, and you can go into Apple Podcasts and look at this, what we saw was 75%, sorry, 75% were 40 minutes or longer. Wow. The median was about 68 minutes.
Okay, that's longer.
This is of the top 200 episodes. Okay. So I should clarify that. Top 200 episodes. So what people voted for, what people voted by downloading. they voted that they like longer content. 75%, 40 minutes or longer. And it was only 6% were 22 minutes or shorter, but 12% were 2 hours or longer.
Wow. Okay.
So double the amount of popular episodes were 2 hours or longer versus 22 minutes or shorter. So if someone tells you 22 minutes is the ideal length, first off, stop listening to them. They don't know podcasting. They probably came out of radio and they have no idea how this medium works. How this medium works is people can hit pause. And if it's the episode's too long for what they're doing at that moment, they'll just listen to the rest of it later on. That's the beauty of podcasting.
I think that's very encouraging, actually, because I'll share a story. When I started the Go for Launch podcast years ago, I reached out to my network, and one of my former clients emailed me and he said, "Man, your podcast is way too long." It was only a 30-minute show. And I'm like, I kind of disagree. He was like, "Yeah, I don't have time for that." So I ignored him, thankfully, and I just kept going, right? Because even at the time, I perceived that, hey, the average person's in the car for X amount of time or in transit for this amount of time. So I'm not going to do the hour and a half Tim Ferriss type of content, because number one, I produce all my shows, so that takes a lot of time and effort.
Yes.
It's good for Lipson because I got to pay for more hosting, but it's pretty cheap, guys, which we'll talk about at the end. But doing the shows 30 minutes for me is palatable, and I can crank out good one a week. But that's the other question I was going to ask you about frequency, Rob. What's a good frequency? I usually tell people, if you're not going to do at least once a week, don't bother, right? But is that necessarily the case?
No,
Okay.
there are it hasn't hurt Dan Carlin, Hardcore History. He releases once a quarter.
True.
Right?
True that.
And he gets 3+ million downloads an episode.
That's more than me.
What I tell people is you have to release on a schedule that works for you. And you don't have to release the same time of the day, the same day of the week each week either. It's better it's better to release it when it's right than right now. So if you think, I got to release it on Monday at 5 a.m. and the episode isn't good and you release it, the worst email is, wow, why did you release that? The best email is, hey, when's the next episode coming out? Right? You'd rather get when's the next episode coming out than lose 10% of your audience because you rushed an episode out on a specific day, specific time to meet some artificial deadline that you've created for yourself. Get the content right and release. Now, if you can do weekly, I will tell you, I do recommend weekly if you can do it, or every other week. But there are some people that release once a month. Some people that release twice a week. Some people release 5 days a week. So it just depends on what works for you in your schedule, your life. I released my one show, Today in iPhone, or Today in iOS is really what it's called now. I release that when I have the next episode ready, whenever that is. Dan Carlin once said it. He goes, I release the next episode when it's better than the last episode.
Nice. That gives me a lot of hope and encouragement, because I'm one of these people who likes to be checking that box and forever. And that's one reason why I stopped podcasting for a while with this particular show. And again, that term pod fading is when you just stop producing a podcast suddenly with no warning, right? I'm guilty of that. But I was doing, every week religiously, thinking I had to have it out at 6 a.m. every Tuesday or whatever the date was. And I felt tremendous guilt and pressure if I wasn't hitting that mark. So you gave me a lot of hope there and relief. Like, Brandon, take a pass, man. If you're, like you said, if something comes up, the episode's not ready, people aren't going to fault you for not having to hit that same day. I love people like Pat Flynn, for example, who is pretty regular about publishing on certain days of the week, right? That's great. If you can get in that cadence, wonderful. But like you said, if life gets in the way, and I'm not going to fault Pat Flynn for not having an episode this week or next week if he comes back with, like you said, a killer episode. So I love your advice there for everybody, including myself. Now, what about this idea, Rob, of instead of putting yourself under the gun to produce a podcast every single week or whatever, what about people that do these episodics? Now, NPR, for one shining example, is brilliant at this. They do these episodics where they say, we're going to have a season coming out and it's going to be X amount of shows, and then we're going to take a pause. That's obviously another effective way to podcast, correct?
It is. The downside you have for that is you're releasing, they'll release 10 episodes, maybe it's once a week for 10 weeks, and then they stop. Some of them will release 10 episodes at one day, like Netflix drop 10 in, and then they don't come back again for 6 months. The problem there is you don't build up an ongoing audience. So when you take these longer periods off, it's hard to keep your momentum going. So yeah, you can do it when you're NPR. The season thing, it's tough, but some people do it. Some people say, you know what, my show is about a television show and it's seasonal, so my show's seasonal. And I understand that, and that makes sense. And those applications works well. If you're doing a show that's about the stock market, being seasonal is a little difficult.
Yeah, right.
The stock market doesn't take seasons off, right? It may have a downturn, but they don't take days off. So, well, they take a few days off, but they don't take weeks off. Hopefully not. If they take weeks off, we're in trouble. But the point is, you have to look at what you're covering and see if it makes sense. Some cases it does, some cases it doesn't.
So let's talk about for the typical podcaster like myself who wants to establish a voice and a presence and with some consistency and frequency and things like that. And then we get into it. Typically, the drill. You're all jazzed up about it. You start off strong out of the gate. You do a couple months of episodes, and then you start getting burned out. And then you go, oh my God, it's a lot of time, effort, technical details, etc. What can you share, Rob, from your experience and working with all these different podcasters? What are some tips or tools or techniques that help overcome, those initial fears, number one, of it's too technical? Because it's really not too technical.
It's not.
We're sitting here doing a Skype interview, right?
Let me put it this way. Do you think it's harder to code an app or to make a podcast?
Let's see. Code an app.
23 million developers.
Yeah.
300,000 podcasters.
Yeah.
Right? It's not too technical. There are a lot of little steps for podcasting, but if 23 million people can code apps, more than a couple million people can do podcasts.
Sure.
So it's not the technical. I hear the technical, but it's not. There's a bunch of steps. Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult than blogging, but if you want to spend the time and commitment, you're going to need to learn it. Now, you have to learn how to record. You have to find a microphone. You have to be able to learn how to edit. And yes, you do need to know how to edit. I think editing is one of the biggest things that people don't do that causes failure. Mm-hmm. People that don't edit podcasts, they release something that is not polished, and their audiences, it's hard to build an audience with something that's not as polished. So I always recommend taking that. I mean, I always remember the one story I love telling is a guy said he wanted me to interview on Podcast 411. He sent me a link to his episode to listen to, and halfway through the episode, you hear a knock at the door. He goes, "Hold on, I'll be right back." He walks away, leaves the recorder going, comes back. You can hear him in the background talking to someone at the door, and it sounded like something out of Peanuts. Wah, 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 wah. And then he comes back. Okay, I'm back. And I just sat there for like 5 minutes just listening to this dead air going, that is an edit point.
Wow.
So respect your audience. Editing is showing respect to your audience. It's like wearing a mask. You're showing respect for those around you. Editing is showing respect to your audience.
I love that. And, a lot of people think, oh, it's expensive because I got to get Adobe Audition or whatever. No, you can get Audacity for free, right? For example.
Right.
Or another program that I love and use is Reaper. Reaper.fm. It's like super cheap. I think you can get it for like, I don't know, $60 or something, like one-time cost. It's a killer platform. All the capabilities of editing that you would get Audition or whatever, just cheaper, right? There's a million of these things. GarageBand.
If you're Mac, you've got GarageBand, right? Yeah. And I'd say the majority of podcasters are on Macs.
Now,
still.
What about some of the weird, quirky stuff like Id3 tags? So, just explain that real quick. Like the fact that an MP3 file, just like a docx or whatever, has got metadata in it. Explain that to people because they don't necessarily know what it is and the benefits of adding those tags.
The benefits are becoming less and less.
Okay.
But what they are is metadata that's embedded in the MP3 file before you upload it. Now, many people don't know how to do that, and Lipson makes it easy where we can actually add the metadata to you after you hit publish. So you can click a little button and we'll put the Id3 tag information in for you. So if you don't know how to do it, we can make it easy for you. That said, when someone subscribes, most of the applications don't look at the metadata on the Id3 tags. It's very few that look at it. I think Overcast is one of the few that looks at it. So most applications today don't look at that metadata. It used to be more important in the early days, and then even Apple started overriding the ID3 tags when you subscribe to a podcast and it gets downloaded. Apple will replace ID3 tags based on what information that's in your RSS feed.
Oh,
So
wow.
even today with Apple Podcasts, and this goes back to the iTunes days, Apple overwrites your ID3 tag with the information they think is more relevant from your RSS feed.
Okay, so we're
So
getting real geeky on people, but just another analogy I like to tell people is like, when you take a digital picture, you got the photo, but if you look at the file information, a lot of times it's appended with where you took the picture, like
mhm.
geolocation data and stuff like that. That's what we're talking about. But in the case of a podcast, you can add things like obviously the show title, the episode number, the author, any copyright information.
I put the show notes in the lyrics tag.
Yeah.
I still do ID3 tags, and I still do it out of habit, and
Yeah, me too.
I've done it from day one.
Yeah.
But when I look at where the benefit is, when I look where that information shows up, it's very few places.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not something that I would say a new podcaster needs to worry about. If you're hosting on Libsyn, at the bottom there's a little checkbox before you hit publish that you can check, and we'll put ID3 tag information in there for you.
When I check that, what does that do? Because like I am a old school as well. I use another freebie called Id3, which is like a little editor on the Mac, right? And
No. If you know how to do it and you're doing it before you upload, don't check it.
okay. But
But if you're not,
if I don't want to
right,
waste that time though, and I
right,
check that box, that kind of gives me a pass. Like the only thing I
yes,
think is most important, probably, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is just making sure that that artwork for that particular episode is uploaded. Is that
right,
about the only thing?
and we'll put that in there for you.
Okay.
If you've uploaded custom artwork per episode, that'll get in there.
Yeah. So, like we were saying earlier, there's just all these little mini steps. Now, if all this went over your head, it's really not that difficult to do. Libsyn has great help files and explains it to you. And again, if you're using Libsyn, you don't even have to mess with that stuff ahead of time. Once you're publishing your episode, you could just start adding some of that information, like Go for Launch
Hmm.
podcast. A lot of it's going to be taken from your default settings, right?
Yeah, right.
But I'm glad that you kind of gave me, again, because it's time consuming, right? To do those ID3 tags, it might take 5-10 minutes, but you add that up over a month, that's 45 minutes of time or whatever, right? So if I can kind of streamline some of that, knowing that it's not as important, then that's super helpful. Um, all right. So again, I'm going to admit I was guilty of this concept of pod fading,
Hmm.
putting the podcast on hold. We've done it, probably many of us for different reasons. You got a partner that was doing it with you that bails, or in my case, I had somebody that had agreed to come on and join me as a co-host who bailed, and I was just like, you know what, I'm done, I'm tired, and I'd said I'll just take a break. That break turned into like 4 years, Rob.
Okay.
Totally, totally horrible. But now I'm back. So
Welcome back.
thank you. What are your tips for somebody like me to like, is it too late to put the paddles on the dead body and resuscitate the
No. You
podcast?
can bring a podcast back at any point in time. That's the beauty of it, right? A lot of television shows go away and then come back later
Yes.
on, right?
This is the,
So
yeah, Go for Launch is the friends of 2020, everyone. So get ready.
right. So yeah, you can bring a show back. Don't worry about that. But it has to fit into your lifestyle. Now, again, you mentioned co-hosts. One thing I always warn, because I hear a lot of podcasts stop doing their shows because of co-hosts. If you have to convince your co-host to do a podcast with you, you have to ask more than once. That's not the right co-host. If
Yes.
you're twisting their arm to get on the show with you, they're going to bail on you at some point because podcasting is more work than blogging. That's why there's less podcasters than bloggers. Right? But it's not a ton of work. But the fact is, if you have to convince someone to do it, they didn't really want to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how many times would you ask someone to marry you? If you got down on one knee, how many times are you going to get down on one knee? If it's more than one, you got to
Yeah.
ask yourself, okay, right, what's going on here?
That's right. Yeah, and the other thing is it just exponentially adds to the complexity. If you and I have to coordinate schedules first and foremost as co-host and with the guest, that's three different schedules. It's a nightmare. And then it's like who does what, blah blah blah. So so you're not suggesting that, or actually should ask that question. In your experience with Lipson, do you find that single hosted shows are just as popular or more popular than multiple hosts, or does it matter?
It doesn't matter, but there are more. I'd say more of the top shows tend to be single hosted. WTF with Mark Maron, Joe Rogan, Hardcore History. A lot of the big shows over the time have been single hosted shows.
Okay.
But that's not. But there have been shows that are a group. Last Podcast on the Left was a group of guys. There's been many other shows that have been two or more hosts, co-hosts. So it just depends on what you're doing. So there are some panel shows that get pretty popular. Panel shows are the easiest to do. You don't have to really prep anything. You just find four people that know a subject, get a few bullet points, and you just go talk. The hardest work is a solo show without a guest, right? Where you're just talking about a specific topic. You got to script that. You got to you got to do a lot of research on a solo show. Solo shows with guests, you got to research a little bit on the guest, and you got to do the editing. Yeah, if you want the easiest show, get four guys talking about video games or Game of Thrones or whatever the latest hot topic in society is. Right. And if you know what you're talking about, you can have a pretty good show.
Good. Well, we've been talking to Rob Walch, VP of Podcaster Relations for Lipson, and I want to ask you, Rob, to wrap up by telling us what's on the roadmap, the horizon for new features for Lipson this year.
Well, the biggest thing is that we're rolling out a brand new UI, so it's a lot more mobile friendly. So we'll have a new UI rolling out here in 2020, and just to make life easier for people on mobile devices, giving some language support for some other languages. So that's coming here shortly.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. And by the way, this episode is not sponsored, but I am an affiliate of Libsyn, which means that I have a special code. If you want to get into podcasting, you're a first-time podcaster and want to check out Libsyn, normally there's not a free trial, but if you use the promo code LAUNCH when you sign up, you can get up to 1+ months for free, which means the day you sign up, you get the rest of that month and the following month, right? So right. Go to Libsyn, LIBSYN.com, and check that out. Rob, any other parting words of advice? You've been fantastic today, opening my eyes to some stuff that I was kind of asleep about, like the Id3 tags and the fact that I'm only among 4,000 people a day if I'm putting a podcast out there, which gives me hope that I can revive this Go for Launch podcast. Any other tips or tricks?
I would say this. What a lot of times people go, what should I podcast about, right? And that's like, what are you passionate about? What are you listening to? What podcasts are you listening to? That's usually a good topic for you to do. And then people go, well, but there's already a podcast on that. I go, well, that didn't stop I Dream a Genie. There was already Bewitched. It didn't stop the Munsters. It was already the Addams Family. That's okay. You're going to bring your personality to the show. Don't worry if there's a show covering that topic. Your show will be different. And there's a lot of time in the week for people to listen to your show if you're just doing a once-a-week show. So if you're listening to podcasts, what are you listening about? If that's what you're really passionate about, chances are it is because you're listening to those topics. That can be what your podcast is about.
Yeah, and one more thing I would say personally is podcasting has been the number one entree that I've had to talk to pretty much anybody. It's amazing to me to this day in 2020 that if you have a podcast regularly produced, you will get asked by all kinds of people, authors, top business people, whomever is in your niche or niche, however you want to say it. Mm-hmm. And I get queries all the time for people. Hey, I want to be on your podcast. I don't even think half of them have listened to it, to be honest with you, but I've landed some killer guests as a result. So that's the other secret of podcasting is, unlike saying, hey, I'm a blogger, I want to blog about you, people are like, I don't care. But for some reason, there's this mystique about podcasts remaining that you can get a lot of killer guests by doing it. Do you agree with that as well?
Oh, absolutely. John Jantz from Duct Tape Marketing said it best. He goes, you can cold call someone because he has a podcast about marketing and he uses it to meet his clients. So he goes, you can cold call someone, you can send an email out and say, hey, I have this service I think you might be interested in, and you get no replies. He goes, or you can send an email out that says, hey, I think you're brilliant. Why don't you come on my show and share your brilliance and intelligence with my audience? And then at the end of the interview, oh, by the way, if you ever need these services, I have it. Yeah. Right? So it opens doors. Podcasting absolutely opens doors. And if you want to speak at conferences, having a podcast, it's real easy to apply when conferences come back. Right?
That's right.
We're talking 2021, 2022 here. When conferences hopefully finally come back, if you want to speak at a conference or a virtual conference nowadays, having a podcast lets people know that, hey, you know how to talk and you know the topic.
One quick thing before we wrap up, because I'm actually doing this for the first time in the last few episodes, is recording the video as well. I was never, yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm like, my voice is okay, but I joke about I have a voice for radio
I have a
versus
hairline.
right.
I have a hairline for audio.
There you go. So normally I'm not on video, but you and I both know video is massive. So again, in the terms of repurposing content, I'm starting to release these on YouTube and as a podcast because why not, right? Is that another thing you're seeing a trend of, Rob?
Audio as a podcast, video to YouTube.
Yep.
Yep. So you release the audio only as the podcast in your
Yep.
RSS feed, and that gets out to all the different services. And then the video you put up on YouTube, and then put a player with the video on your blog.
Yep. And so,
Yep.
but the point being is like, why not? Because,
Right.
I did almost 100 episodes with no video. I'm kicking myself going, I should have done that. Right. But again, I didn't think about it because I don't want to be on camera or whatever, but you got to get past that. Goes back to that whole imposter syndrome or whatever. I'm no Pat Flynn, but hey, I'm having fun. Like you said, I love talking to people like yourself, others in the business world. And so it's a passion, really is. And that's why I'm back to it, because I'm like, you know what? It is. It's like a hobby. And I do make a little money doing it, not a ton, but that helps. But yeah, Lipson is obviously a tremendous affordable platform. From the day I started on it, I was like, this is really affordable and it makes perfect sense to go here. And you guys have been tremendous on the support. So thank you so much, Rob, for everything you guys do at Libsyn as well.
Well, thank you for hosting with us and the kind words. And yeah, and you mentioned keyword there, hobby. And most people will never make money on this. But that said, you have a potential to make money. My dad has been golfing. He's 83 years old. He's been golfing his whole life. He makes no money from golf. He still does it. It's his hobby, right? If podcasting's your hobby, you'll be around for a while.
Yeah. Well, he should start the 83-year-old golfers podcast. Talk about the challenges of swinging and not breaking your hip and stuff like that. Well, Rob, thank you so much for being on the Go for Launch podcast. It's great to reconnect with you as well. And thanks for kind of kicking me, spurring me, going, hey, man, your podcast has been dormant. You need to crank it back up. So I can pretty much blame you or thank you either way. Depending, I'll let you know in a couple months. But you're the guy who got me back to the mic. So thank you so much.
All right, Brandon. Well, welcome back, and I'm glad I could help you get inspired to get your show going again.